Positive parenting hacks for ADHD kids. So, my name is Parisa, and I am a child therapist as well as a parent coach. And my specialty is in helping neurodiverse kiddos and their parents basically have a better life, figure out how to manage their struggles, and find solutions. So, some of the common struggles that if you have an ADHD kid or if you have one who you're wondering if they have ADHD, these are the typical things that parents are dealing with: emotional regulation, focus and attention, time management, organization, social skills, and sensory issues. So, we will kind of go through each category and I will give you some tips and hacks as to how to deal with them and see if that works for you. Self regulation. So, that basically is, in a nutshell, your tantrums. When the kids are melting down, sometimes it seems like they're overreacting to a situation emotionally, and the way they're dealing with their intense emotions is pretty extreme. They have a hard time calming down, and I'm pretty sure you know what that's like. And the reason for that is that the ADHD kids basically typically experience emotions more intensely, and it might seem like they're overreacting, whether they're angry, they're frustrated, sad. But that's pretty typical for an ADHD person, or especially a kid, to sort of have a hard time self regulating, which means kind of coming back to neutral when you're really upset. So, what are some of the ways that you can help these kids? The number one would be what we call co regulating. And what that means is something very simple, but at the same time, pretty hard to do sometimes. And that means to keep your own cool. So, it is really easy to get triggered when your child is screaming on the floor, melting down, and having a really tough time. What they need the most is for you to sort of stay calm and neutral. It doesn't mean that you can let them do whatever they want, right? Let's say you're at Target and they wanted this specific toy, they couldn't get it, and they're on the floor screaming and kicking, depending on the age or your kid. So my suggestion is not to give them what they want, but at the same time, one of the hardest things to do is to keep your own cool. And that can be hard, especially if you're in a public place. You are worried about judgment from other people, but you will have to let that go and do your best to self regulate. So that way, the child can use basically your nervous system and your regulation that will help them to also calm down sooner. Number two is paying attention to whether they've had enough sleep, food, water, and sort of the sensory um, needs and issues around that. Because the ADHD kids are not only more sensitive to emotions, they also tend to be, in my experience, just generally more sensitive to, I would say, almost everything. So let's say everybody does better when they had enough sleep, but these kids are especially sensitive to that. So if they haven't, they've had some sleep issues for a while and they haven't had enough sleep, that will make everything else worse, including they also tend to forget that they're hungry or they haven't had food or even they're thirsty. Part of ADHD is sort of like this, almost like a bit of a disconnection from the body signals. So they could be very hungry, but they're not realizing that. And the low blood sugar and all of that will make them more irritable. So anytime you notice your ADHD kiddo is just kind of like irritable and everything is getting to them, I would say the first question to ask is, have you had food? Are you thirsty? Right? Or just kind of pay attention to that. Have they had enough sleep? Another part of that element is sensory, meaning that they're also more sensitive to stimulation that's coming from the environment. So, if they've been in an environment that's pretty loud, overstimulating, and sometimes that's why shopping experiences can be difficult because there is a lot of stimulation and they have a harder time kind of staying grounded. So, What you want to do is almost approach things first from a biological level, meaning food, water, are they tired? Do we need to take a break from this environment? And only after that go into other things, where it's like what is going on with the child. Number three is predefined rules, plans, consequences, and less surprises. So, what I mean by that is, I'll give you a scenario that happens almost to everybody, right? Something happens. Let's go back to the shopping, right? And your child suddenly wants this toy. You say no, they're freaking out, and you're getting embarrassed and overwhelmed. And to, so a lot of times people do one of two things: either they give up and give the child what they want just to get it over with, or they go the punishment route of, if you don't stop, I'm going to take this away and taking that away. And I have to tell you, neither one works. The reason is, by giving in, you're basically reinforcing that behavior. And just kind of teaching the child that if they make a big enough fuss, even though initially it wasn't intended to get their way, it does reinforce that. When you're taking things away, it also doesn't work. Mainly because this creates sort of like a power struggle, unfair situation where they didn't know that was coming. One of the things that I want you to really think about is, do not give consequences in the moment when there's a crisis or intensity, because typically we are emotional, and then we say something that is not fair or relevant, and then we end up either not doing that and lose credibility, or we'll pay for it, like no TV for a week, and then you're sitting there just like, I wish I never said that, right? So if it's not an emergency, that 99% of the time, these situations, it is not an emergency, it just feels like it. Deal with the crisis in the moment, meaning calm things down and come up with rules and consequences in advance. An example would be being very clear that in this trip where we're going to Target, there will be no shopping. We can look at things, we can take pictures if you like really something, or that you can have one item up to this amount. Now, I'm not saying if you do that, there will be zero meltdown. Typically, there'll be less, and if there is, there'll be less intense because they're prepared. Routines also, same thing. The kids in general, most kids do well with routines and knowing what is coming in their day, but especially neurodiverse kids and ADHD kiddos have a really hard time transitioning from one task to another. They can get really hyper focused in something, in their mind have their own plans of what's coming up, and they also kind of lose track of time. Then you suddenly come and say it's time to go do this other thing, and they will most likely lose their temper. So try to kind of minimize surprises. Next, we have time management. So it's pretty well known that the ADHD style of brain, one of the main struggles is time management. There's a thing called almost like a time blindness, or the ADHD brain kind of processes time differently, and that can result into a lot of problems, including usually being late for things, missing deadlines, doing things last minute, and a lot of stress for the child and for the whole family. So what that means is that they need more help than a typical child in those areas. And some of the things you can do to help are breaking tasks into smaller steps, because a big chunk of sort of like, let's say, homework typically is pretty overwhelming for an ADHD kid. And part of that also is that they typically need more breaks. So you would want to sort of break a big project into smaller steps and kind of plan those ahead and help them. That becomes less overwhelming and easier to manage, also managing the time. Number two is visual timers, and generally anything visual, anything. It's kind of like with the ADHD brain. Out of sight, out of mind is how things work. So if you tell this kid you have 5 minutes, 10 minutes, even an hour to do something, even the older kids, I mean, let alone the younger kids, don't have a concept of time, but even the older kids, because of the ADHD, they don't really feel time the same. So that 1 hour can feel, especially if they're hyper focusing, like a minute, right? So it's like it kind of almost jolts them when you say, oh, the hour is over. A visual timer can really help, and you can find those almost everywhere. Go online, and the good thing about that is you can see the time moving. So just kind of checking it once in a while, they can see how much time has passed, how much is left. And the same goes with sort of routines. It really helps to have a visual schedule where somewhere they can see where today these are the things that we are doing that are getting done, and that way it kind of keeps refocusing the brain on what's coming up and being prepared for it. And creating consistent routines, again, that works typically for most children, but it really helps with ADHD kids because of that element of impulsiveness, hyper focus, low focus, time management, all of those issues. You want to create habits. Habits are things you don't think about. So you're not relying on your brain to remember you need to do this new thing right now at this time. Once it becomes a habit, like brushing your teeth before bedtime, right? It almost is easier. At least you don't have to like use that brain capacity to remember, which they're not good at, and all of that. So routines and habits really help. It takes time, and consistency is important, so it becomes a habit and you don't have to think about it. Focus and attention. This is probably one of the most misunderstood parts of what it means to have ADHD. If you talk to people, I guess a common misunderstanding is somebody who has ADHD brain, basically they cannot focus, right? They have a hard time focusing. And that cannot be further from the truth, in a sense of it is a difference in how you focus. A lot of people, when the idea of a kid having ADHD comes up, they come and say, well, when she or he is playing games or doing something they like, they can absolutely focus for hours. And absolutely, that is the flip side of um, focus side with ADHD, where it's either almost hyper focus or no, like really difficulty focusing. And it is based on interest. So if they are really interested in something, they can hyper focus. That's where you're talking to them and they're saying yes or no, but they're really actually not hearing you. They're hyper focusing on a task. They can do it for hours, literally forgetting to go to the bathroom or eat. And it's sort of kind of a bit of a superpower of ADHD, where a modified version of it, people can do a lot of like really interesting things in a short amount of time when they go through that hyper focus, but things that are considered boring and not stimulating enough is really hard to focus on. It's almost like your brain is constantly looking for something interesting and stimulating. And once it finds that, it will hyper focus on it. But if there's nothing like interesting about washing the dishes, it feels like torture. It's hard to focus and you keep getting distracted, or maybe even homework. Structure and routine again can help with that in different ways, because it helps you and kind of getting into that habit of checking what's coming up. It's almost like there's a thing called executive functioning, which is the overall, like your brain has this overall manager, let's say, that's looking at what is being done, how much time it does it need, what's coming next. And ADHD people don't have great executive functioning skills, right? So they're like in the moment, all in or not at all. So that structure and routine and visuals can help kind of with that a lack of executive functioning skills, and focus you into, okay, there's something else coming up in this amount of time. and self-monitoring. So basically kind of bringing awareness into um, where you stand as far as, everything, including focus and attention, and helping them learn about how their brain works can be really, really an amazing tool, and helps them not feel like they are bad kids, there's something wrong with them, they're stupid, they're troublemakers, which is typically what I see in the children when they come to me. Those are some of the core beliefs they start to sort of believe in because they're in trouble a lot. Next is organization. So, pretty well known that people with ADHD, especially children, struggle with organization and planning ahead. That's why you always see missing deadlines and kind of, having trouble with assignments, homework, things like that, finding things, right? Kind of finding where things are, putting things where they belong. And it's really important to realize that this is not being lazy. I think that mind shift and paradigm shift is the most important part to realize, is that it is truly a function of the ADHD brain, where your brain is not paying attention to these details, taking your coat off and just dropping it right there, putting things in places and then forgetting where they are. It's sort of like, for the ADHD brain, it's almost like this. The priority goes back to the executive functioning. If there is, most things are low priority if there is no immediate reward. So, in a sense, it's like taking my coat off, going and putting it where it belongs is not a high priority in the brain, because it's sort of like immediately it doesn't affect me, right? So the brain is not actually paying attention to that. Now, it is important to learn those skills, but it's also important to not be shaming, sort of doing it in a shaming way, and more in a sense of, these are the areas of struggle, and that's okay. There are other areas you're really good at, and let me help you. The visual schedule or any sort of visual organization can really help. Having a large calendar maybe on the wall with all the deadlines so they're reminded of it, right? Having color coded bins or places, just kind of making it easier. Simplifying and decluttering. So I used to, by the way, I do have ADHD myself and have a child who has ADHD, and decluttering can be amazing because it's really difficult with all these differences. If you have a bunch of stuff and you always have to put them in specific places, it's really difficult. So the more minimized your environment is and more functional, then less clutter you have, and it's easier to keep things organized. And again, breaking tasks into smaller steps can help with the organization of, let's say there's a deadline, we're gonna break this project to these parts, and we're gonna get this part done by this time, and just so on and so forth. Social skills. I think this is one area where maybe it's not often talked about, how ADHD and social skills, there is something here to notice, and that is usually children with ADHD feel different from their peers. They tend to be getting feedbacks, and I would say, I most of the time I see that happen right around third grade or so, where other kids are suddenly kind of coming out of that silly, goofy, all over place, and changing, and it's almost like the ADHD kiddos are stuck in the past and they can't relate as much. They're being told they're annoying or they're weird or things like that, and they have a really hard time um, with friendships, and how to have friends and keep friends and all of that. So teaching them social cues, in a sense of, let's say your kid, I'm sure you've seen it, is making certain noises or being hyper and people are getting agitated, and just kind of bringing that to their awareness, but again, in a non shaming way, where it's like pay attention to other people's cues of how they're feeling, right? Seems like this is too much. And that can really help because a lot of times they're not paying attention to that until somebody just goes off on them and call them weird or just yells at them or something like that. That gets their attention. Foster empathy and listening skills. So, because of that, all of the things we talked about, they're kind of the ADHD brain is fast on the go and all over the place, and it can make it difficult in any kind of relationship, especially kind of kids and peers. They might seem rude or not having empathy, and that cannot be further from the truth. The problem is that it's almost there's part of an impulse control too, that they say things before they even think about it, right? And it can be offending someone or difficult. So just kind of working with them on those skills in a delicate way can be very helpful. This part I made it so small. I don't know what I wrote, but you can also always model that for them. So, one of the biggest ways we teach our kids is by modeling. It's not what we're saying, it's what we are doing. So, the more we can have empathy for them, listen, and sort of pay attention to their cues and kind of model all of these things, they will learn it much better than just telling it to them. Sensory issues. Another thing that I don't know how well known it is that almost all ADHD kiddos have some sensory differences. So what that means is, when we are in an environment, our senses are getting messages from the environment, send it to our brain, and we process that. That processing is typically different in an ADHD brain, and I would say typically they can get overstimulated easily because like especially in an environment that there's a lot of interesting things, it can be overwhelming. Again, going back to that shopping experience, and it's like, oh, look at this and look at that. I'm definitely guilty of that, and it's almost disorienting, right? And the noises, the sounds, the all of that, also being hyper aware of that. And the ironic thing is sometimes the kids start almost acting out and being more hyper, louder, because they kind of want to shut out or regulate themselves and they can. And few might kind of shut down and instead of that. But I would say with ADHD kiddos, I've noticed mostly they will almost become more hyper, louder, and all of that. And it's important to learn what are the triggers. It's not exactly the same with everyone. One kid might be very sensitive to noise and noisy places or visual distractions. Just kind of identifying triggers and avoiding them if we need to, let's say, get quickly in and out of somewhere, being aware of that and preparing for that. It's really important to create a sensory friendly space for these kiddos. I typically suggest a little, for example, calm down place where it's not overwhelming visually. It's kind of quiet and calm. There's some fidgets, some soft things, whatever they like, that they can just go there and sort of calm down and regulate their nervous system and incorporate sensory activities into daily routine. That's where a lot of ADHD kiddos can really benefit, especially the younger ones, from OT, occupational therapy. Which is basically addressing those sensory issues. If some of them might be certain activities, certain things that you can do throughout the day to help them regulate sort of their sensory difficulties and help them ground themselves. And that is about it. There's definitely a lot more to say, but my main goal is to help parents and even the kids themselves, honestly, to stop seeing things like ADHD as a disorder, which I honestly don't see it that way. We're moving more toward a neurodiversity model where there's, all our brains are not the same. And of course, there are some that are more typical and some that are not as typical. And that can cause challenges because it's like wanting a fish to like run on the land, right? That the environment is not made for you. And but there are definitely strengths, and the more we kind of bring awareness about that and move away from this is just a difficult, bad child who is acting out on purpose and all of that, that's not going to get you anywhere, but also it's going to cause a lot of damage to these kids that I've seen, at very young ages, even start talking about how they hate themselves. Even if they're not showing it on the surface, some will go into depression and sort of say those things out loud. Some will go into anger and acting out, and I hate you, and just kind of that. But underneath, it's the same message that I hear once I connect with them. I hate myself. There's something wrong with me. Nobody likes me. Even I wish I wasn't born is a very common thing I hear in kids as young as like 5 years old, even. So we want to change that, and we want to show them that yes, there are things we need to change. There are things that you're having a difficult time with, but I'm on your side and we'll figure this out together. And you are not bad. There is nothing wrong with you. And you also have a lot to offer and a lot of good things. So let's turn ADHD challenges into strengths with empathy and understanding lighting our way. And that is it for today.